In the spring of 2019, 46-year-old Ruth Halverson was told by three separate men at the Baird County Co-op that she was making the same mistake her father had made 20 years earlier. She was refusing to cut down her windbreak. A windbreak, a long planted row of trees along a field's edge, takes up land. It shades a strip of crop. Its roots compete with cash crops for water 20, 30, sometimes 40 feet into the field. And on a farm where every acre is calculated down to the bushel, a mile and a half of trees running along Ruth's northern property line looked, to a lot of people in Baird County, like wasted ground. "You could get 4, 5 more usable acres if you pulled that row," one of them told her. "Your dad planted it during the Dust Bowl scare. Different time, different problem." Ruth had heard some version of this conversation at least 6 times that year. She said no every time. She did not explain herself in detail. She simply said, "The trees stay." This is the rural file. Ruth Halverson's father, Elmer Halverson, had planted the windbreak in 1974, following a program encouraged by the Soil Conservation Service in the wake of decades of dust-related soil loss across the Great Plains. He planted 3 rows, eastern red cedar on the outer edge, for density, hackberry, and green ash behind it, for height and canopy spread. Elmer used to tell Ruth, when she was young enough to still be riding in the tractor cab beside him, that a windbreak wasn't really about the trees. It was about what the trees did to the wind. When Ruth took over the farm in 2009 after her father's retirement, the windbreak was 40 feet tall in places and had become, in the eyes of most of her neighbors, an increasingly outdated relic. Modern equipment was bigger. Modern field layouts favored uninterrupted rows for GPS-guided planting and harvest efficiency. And modern grain prices meant every acre mattered more than it had in 1974. Farm after farm across Baird County had pulled their windbreaks in the 2 decades before 2019, not out of malice or ignorance, but out of a straightforward calculation that the immediate yield gain from a few extra acres outweighed a benefit that was hard to see day to day. Ruth's neighbor directly to the west, a man named Kurt Iverson who farmed 900 acres and had known Ruth since she was a child, had pulled his own windbreak in 2015. "Kurt used to needle me about it," Ruth would say later. "Not meanly. He genuinely thought I was leaving money on the table, and by the numbers he was looking at, I was." By 2019, Ruth's windbreak was one of fewer than a dozen still standing in the entire county at its original length and density. She had been asked to justify it more times than she could count. She never gave the full answer, because the full answer, as it turned out, would not matter to anyone until one specific Tuesday in June. On the morning of June 11th, the regional forecast called for scattered thunderstorms with a moderate risk of damaging wind. Nobody in Baird County treated it as unusual. Nebraska farmers see moderate wind risk forecasts dozens of times a season. Most amount to a hard rain and a few downed branches. By early afternoon, the forecast changed. A line of severe thunderstorms had developed faster and more intensely than models had predicted, feeding off unusually warm, moisture-heavy air that had settled over the region for 3 days. The National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Baird County at 3:40 p.m., upgraded to include a rare derecho warning by 4:15. A derecho, a widespread, long-lived windstorm associated with a fast-moving band of severe thunderstorms, can produce sustained straight-line winds comparable to a hurricane across a path hundreds of miles long. Ruth was in her equipment shed when the sky went the specific green-black color that farmers in the region learn to recognize before they learn much else. She had maybe 11 minutes of warning before the wind hit. What hit Baird County that afternoon lasted 19 minutes. Sustained winds over 80 miles per hour, with gusts recorded as high as 98, tore across roughly 40 miles of open farmland, with almost nothing standing in the way to slow it down. Kurt Iverson's 900 acres of corn, planted in clean, uninterrupted rows since he'd removed his windbreak 4 years earlier, took the full, unbroken force of the wind. 91% of his standing crop was flattened beyond recovery. 3 other neighboring farms, all of which had removed their windbreaks in the previous 15 years, reported similar losses, between 70 and 95% of standing crop damage, plus structural damage to outbuildings, grain bins, and in 2 cases, machine sheds whose open sides had let the wind get underneath the roofs. Ruth's farm sat directly in the storm's path. Her windbreak took the wind first. The eastern red cedar on the outer row lost significant branch material. 2 hackberries near the center of the row were split by the wind and would later need to be removed. But the row held. And more importantly, what came out the other side of it, the wind that actually reached Ruth's cropland, had been broken up, slowed, and redirected enough that her corn, while damaged, was not destroyed. The morning after the derecho, county extension agents and insurance adjusters fanned out across Baird County to assess damage. What they found, field by field, became the subject of a report that would circulate through agricultural circles across 3 states by the following winter. The correlation was not subtle. Every farm in the county that still had a functioning windbreak, there were 9 of them, Ruth's the largest and oldest, showed dramatically lower crop losses than farms in open, unbroken fields. Kurt Iverson drove over to Ruth's farm 4 days after the storm. He walked her northern field with her, looking at the line where windbreak-sheltered corn gave way, hundreds of yards out, to more significant damage. He did not say much at first. Then he said, "I took that thing out because it was costing me 4 acres. Ruth said nothing. "I lost $600,000 in corn in 19 minutes, Kurt said. 4 acres would have been a rounding error. Ruth said, "My dad used to say the trees weren't really about the trees." Kurt asked what he meant. She said, "He said they were about the wind you don't see coming." What Ruth Halverson did was not complicated, and it did not require any special foresight about that specific storm on that specific Tuesday in June. She simply declined to optimize away a form of protection whose value only becomes visible in the one event most people spend their whole careers never experiencing. Here is what her story leaves behind. The first thing, some costs are visible every single year, and some benefits are invisible until the one year they are the only thing that matters. A windbreak costs you measurable acreage annually. It only pays you back catastrophically, all at once, on a day you cannot predict. Most financial reasoning is bad at valuing that kind of asymmetry, because spreadsheets reward what is countable, and protection against rare disaster is not countable until the disaster arrives. The second thing, consensus is not evidence. 60% of Baird County's windbreak acreage disappeared over 20 years because most farmers, independently, made the same reasonable-looking calculation. Being outnumbered in a decision does not mean being wrong in it. The third thing, infrastructure that looks like waste in ordinary years often is doing its actual job in the one year that counts. Ruth's windbreak did not stop the storm. It broke its force early, over the first few hundred yards, in a way that meant everything behind it took less of the blow. And the fourth thing, Kurt Iverson was not a fool for pulling his windbreak, and Ruth was not simply lucky for keeping hers. He made a rational bet against a low-probability event, and the event happened anyway. That is not stupidity. That is what risk actually looks like when it eventually shows up. 6 weeks after the storm, the Baird County Soil and Water Conservation District held a public meeting. Attendance was higher than any meeting in the district's recent history. 3 farmers in the county have since begun replanting windbreaks along field edges they had cleared within the last decade. Ruth's windbreak is still standing. The 2 split hackberries were removed and replaced with new saplings the following spring. Her father's original cedars, 45 years old this year, are still there. This is the rural file. Every farm has a decision somebody questioned for years before the one day it mattered. Subscribe for stories from the farms, valleys, and counties that hold the real history of how people protect what they've built, sometimes decades before they know why it matters. New story every week. If Ruth's story taught you something today, about patience, about ignoring pressure to optimize away protection, about the difference between a cost you can see and a risk you can't, share it with one person who needs to hear it. And drop this in the comments. What's the thing in your life everyone's told you to cut, that you've kept anyway? We read every one.